Hello, friends. It's Aunt Nikki of Your Story Hour, and we're here to read another chapter since we're doing our stay at home and being careful with being out and about, and here's something to do. We're going to read chapters 5 and 6 today of The Bluebirds and Their Neighbors, and the author is Neil Wayne Northey. Let me get that right. All right, chapter 5. Mr. Bluebird has help. Mr. Bluebird was disappointed. It was enough to discourage anyone to see someone else in his home. He didn't know what to do, but he knew he would have to do something. He knew that Mr. and Mrs. Noisy would never give up his house without a fight, and Mr. Bluebird disliked fights. He worried about the affair all night. Mr. Bluebird was still thinking about it the next morning and wondering what to do. He wasn't quite sure that with Mrs. Bluebird's help, he would be able to get possession of the nesting box. He wished that she were here to help, though, and so Mr. Bluebird sat around all day worrying, while Mr. and Mrs. Northey, the English Sparrows, chattered and bragged and fussed among themselves and with everyone else that came near. They were making such a fuss that Bud Smith wondered what they were doing when he came home from school. Then he saw Mr. Bluebird for the first time that year. "Mr. Bluebird is back!" he shouted to Mary. "Jolly spring must be here!" He drove Mr. and Mrs. Noisy, the English Sparrows, away from the nesting box, but they came right back as soon as he left. Bud didn't like that because he had made the nesting box for Mr. Bluebird. But Noisy, the English Sparrow, is rude. His bad manners make him unwelcome wherever he goes. He bothers people and bullies the other birds in a way that makes him a pest. None of the wild creatures liked him. We have a picture. Let's see if I can get it lined up for you guys to see. There's the picture. And the picture says, "The English sparrows came right back to the nesting box." Okay. He is not at all like his American cousins, the tree sparrows or the song sparrows and the white-throated sparrows and the chipping sparrows and others who are really good neighbors. Sometimes we are blamed because of something our relatives do, and that is the way it is with the sparrows, because Noisy, the English sparrow, is an outlaw. All the other sparrows have been disgraced. "I didn't make the nesting box quite right," said Bud Smith. He went to the shop and built another. It was like the first one, except that the doorway was nearer the top, and there was no porch in front. Bud took the first one down and put up the other. Of course, Mr. and Mrs. Noisy, the English Sparrows, came right away to take possession of it. They lit on the top and peeked over at the little round door. There was nothing in front to stand on before hopping inside. Mr. Noisy tried to fly into the hole without stopping outside. He bumped his head on the side of the box and returned to the roof to think about it. Then Mrs. Noisy tried to get inside. Yes, sir, she would show Mr. Noisy how to do it. She tried to hold onto the side of the box, but it was too smooth. She didn't know how to hang on, and she couldn't get inside without first hanging on. Her attempts to show Mr. Noisy didn't work out so well after all. It was a busy time that Mr. and Mrs. Noisy, the English Sparrows, had. They chattered and they scolded. They tried this way and that to get into the nesting box. They kept it up until the long shadows came and drove them away for the night. And they spent half of the next day trying before they finally learned how to get inside. Whatever else Noisy the English Sparrow may be, he is not a quitter. Mr. Bluebird was amused at their awkward attempts to get inside. After they left, he flew to the round door, clutched the bottom edge of it, and looked around. Then he ducked his head slightly and went inside. It was so easy for Mr. Bluebird that he really could not understand why Mr. and Mrs. Noisy had such a time. Mr. Bluebird looked around inside. The box smelled new and fresh, and it was the right size. He was sure that Mrs. Bluebird would like it. Then he came outside. The nesting box was fastened to the top of an iron pipe so that Hunting Cat could not climb up. The next day Mr. and Mrs. Noisy visited the nesting box again, but after going inside once or twice, they left in disgust. "I am sure I can find a handier nesting place than this," said Mrs. Noisy impatiently as they flew away, and Mr. Bluebird felt quite safe. He was anxious for Mrs. Bluebird to come so that he could show her their new home. At last Mr. Bluebird was happy. He sat on top of his new home and sang his thanks. "True-a-lee, true-a-lee, this is a fine nesting box," he said. Bud Smith heard him, and he was happy also. Mr. Bluebird felt hungry. He had been so busy visiting old friends that he had not eaten much since he arrived at the old homestead. He decided to fly to the big jungle thicket in the edge of the Black Forest and see if he could find some dried berries to eat. It was a foolish thing for him to do. Right that minute Sharpen the hawk was sitting on a dead limb in the Black Forest, watching for a bird, because he was hungry himself. And he saw Mr. Bluebird as he flashed across the field towards the big jungle thicket. Bluebird would taste quite good for supper, he thought to himself. "I believe I'll fly along among the trees and see if I can't surprise Mr. Bluebird. Yes, sir, I think I'll go over to the big jungle thicket and catch Mr. Bluebird before he knows I am near." Sharpen the hawk spread his sharp toes as he thought how much fun it would be to sink them into Mr. Bluebird. Then he spread his strong wings and sailed away silently through the long shadows of the Black Forest. It's a good thing we're not stopping there. Chapter 6, A Visit to the Black Forest. And we do know Mr. Bluebird will be okay. When Mr. Bluebird arrived at the big jungle thicket in the edge of the Black Forest, he stopped right in the middle of some blackberry brambles. There were still some dried berries clinging to the bushes, and they tasted sweet, with now and then a fat beetle when it could be found. Mr. Bluebird was enjoying himself greatly. He went from branch to branch and from vine to vine without much thought of just where he was going. At last he found himself near the edge of an open spot in the big jungle thicket. It was a rather large open spot, sheltered by the surrounding trees and brambles, and there were a few blades of early grass showing up on the forest floor. And right there in the middle of the open spot, whom do you suppose Mr. Bluebird saw? Why, Snowshoe the hare, of course. He was eating the tender grass shoots. Mr. Bluebird thought it would be fun to fly over and scare him. He would not let Snowshoe know he was there until he was right by him, and then Snowshoe would think he was Great Horn the Owl. He was just ready to fly when out hopped another rabbit. Mr. Bluebird wondered what to do. He wanted to have a visit with Snowshoe, but he didn't want to interrupt his talk with another rabbit. That would not be polite. While he sat there wondering what to do, Sharpen the hawk sailed out of the long shadows and saw him. It was a very dangerous position to be in, and Mr. Bluebird knew it. He was so frightened at first that he couldn't move. He knew that it would be little protection for him to attempt to run through the big jungle thicket, because Sharpen would follow on foot if he had to. If he tried to fly, Sharpen would catch him before he got very far, because Sharpen had a very good start. And so he tumbled down into the dense blackberry brambles and waited for Sharpen to strike. Now it happened that Mr. Bluebird was not the only one who had come to the big jungle thicket that evening for supper. On the other side of the big jungle thicket, Scraper the kingbird had been feasting on bugs and dried berries. Everyone knew that Scraper the kingbird did not like Sharpen the hawk. At least Sharpen the hawk knew it. And when Sharpen heard a loud keep, keep, kip, kippa, 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 kip, hope I did that right, he knew that it was time to be moving away from there. In fact, he completely forgot about the bluebird supper he had planned. Didn't make any difference to Scraper the kingbird that Sharpen the hawk was several times larger than he was, and he didn't hesitate because Sharpen was armed with needle-like claws. No, sir, he dived at Sharpen the hawk and landed right on his back. Then how he made the feathers fly! There was Sharpen doing his best to get away while Scraper the kingbird rode on his back, picking out feathers as fast as he could. When Scraper the kingbird finally let loose and flew back to the big jungle thicket, he left a rumpled hawk flapping his wings frantically to get away. Snowshoe the hare and his friends had run thumpity-thump-thump to the shelter of a blackberry brambles when they had heard Scraper the kingbird's warning, "Keep, keep, kip, kippa, 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 kip." And they didn't stop to see what it was about. There's a picture. If we get it close enough, you can see right there the kingbird is on Sharpen's back, and there's feathers flying. Let's see what it says. Scraper the kingbird dived at Sharpen the hawk and landed right on his back. All right, let's find my place. All right. At last, Mr. Bluebird got enough courage to come out of the brambles where he had fallen. He looked around. There was Scraper the kingbird eating as if nothing had happened. It was the first time Mr. Bluebird had seen him since the previous fall, when the bluebirds and the song sparrows and robins and orioles and kingbirds had gathered in flocks and started for the sunny Southland. Mr. Bluebird knew that Scraper the kingbird was his friend, but he hadn't realized that he was such a good one. "Truly, that was a narrow escape," he said. "I thank you for saving my life." "That's all right," said Scraper the kingbird with a chuckle. "That's one hawk that will not be back right away." "I believe it would be a good time for me to get back to the old homestead," said Mr. Bluebird. "I think I'll be going before it gets dark." Not that he was afraid to fly in the dark. He had flown from the sunny Southland mostly at night. He wanted to get back home in time to see the new nesting box. That was what he wanted. As he was passing the old apple orchard, he thought he heard a familiar voice. He lit on the new fence and listened. Sure enough, he heard it again. It came from the other side of the apple orchard. "Ha, ha, ha, ha!" Red Robin had arrived. Mr. Bluebird flew over in that direction. He found Robin Red looking for worms and bugs. Robin Red spends most of his time looking for something to eat when he isn't busy singing or helping Mrs. Robin Red. "Hello, neighbor," said Mr. Bluebird. "I see that you are back." "Ha, ha, ha, ha!" laughed Robin Red, back again and ready to start work on a new nest. What he meant was that Mrs. Robin Red would do most of the nest building while he sat around and sang to her. "I see there is a new nesting box near my red cedar tree," continued Robin Red, "and Jenny Wren has taken possession of it." "Surely, surely not," said Mr. Bluebird. "That is my nesting box." It was almost dark, and Mr. Bluebird hurried away to see if what Robin Red had said was true. We'll find out in the next chapter. Thanks for listening with us. Let us know what you think. Bye-bye.